Good evening. What unfolded over the past 48 hours in Eastern Europe has sent a shockwave not only across the Ukrainian battlefield, but through NATO, the White House, and most importantly, the Kremlin. Ukraine launched an attack so precise, so disruptive, and so politically explosive that Moscow's immediate response was not just military, it was accusatory. Within minutes of the strike being confirmed, Russia publicly blamed the United States, not Kiev, for orchestrating the operation. And the speed with which the Kremlin issued that accusation reveals something deeper and far more dangerous. Russia believes the war has now reached a point where every major Ukrainian success is tantamount to a U.S. attack on Russia itself. That belief is not rhetorical. It is strategic, and it is the foundation of nearly every escalation risk the world faces right now. The attack in question was not a routine artillery hit or a drone strike against a supply depot. It was a highly complex, multi-layered operation that targeted one of Russia's most sensitive military nodes, a location previously considered too deep behind the lines, too secure, and too heavily monitored for Ukraine to reach without outside support. Russian intelligence officials admitted privately and reluctantly that the strike required satellite-level targeting, real-time surveillance data, and precision munitions that Ukraine does not deploy without coordination with Western partners. Moscow seized on that fact instantly, and instead of treating this as a battlefield loss, the Kremlin elevated it into the geopolitical realm, declaring that Washington had crossed a line. From Moscow's perspective, this isn't paranoia. It is a worldview shaped by decades of distrust and reinforced by the realities of the war. Russia sees U.S. support not as assistance to Ukraine, but as direct involvement. American intelligence is helping Ukraine identify weak points. American surveillance assets track Russian troop movements. American-made missiles hit Russian bases. American decision makers coordinate military packages specifically designed to cripple Russia's capabilities. So when this latest Ukrainian attack landed exactly where Russia feared most, it was only a matter of time before the Kremlin concluded and publicly declared that the United States was behind it. What unsettles Washington isn't simply the accusation, it's the context in which the accusation was made. Russia did not issue a diplomatic complaint. It did not summon U.S. officials for symbolic theatrics. It went straight to a narrative of retaliation. A narrative framed not around Ukraine, but around the United States. That shift matters because when a nuclear-armed great power stops blaming its immediate battlefield opponent and starts blaming its global rival, it signals that escalation ladders are about to get steeper. The mechanics of the attack themselves reveal why the Kremlin reacted so aggressively. Ukrainian forces executed a synchronized drone and missile operation that exploited a temporary rotation gap in Russian air defenses. They struck at a moment when electronic countermeasure units had shifted to another sector, when radar coverage briefly thinned, and when Russian officers were rotating between commands. The result was devastating for Moscow. Key equipment was destroyed, several senior officers were killed, and perhaps most importantly, the strike disrupted a logistics cycle Russia had been preparing for weeks. The scale of the losses is something the Kremlin cannot hide. And when a great power suffers a sudden, unexpected blow, it looks for an explanation that preserves its prestige. Blaming Ukraine alone would imply Russian incompetence. Blaming the United States, however, allows Moscow to frame the strike as a confrontation between global powers, not a humiliating tactical defeat. This is a pattern seen throughout history. When great powers face setbacks, they redefine them as part of a larger strategic confrontation. It protects domestic legitimacy. It justifies future escalation. It prepares the population psychologically for a longer, harsher conflict. But what is truly dangerous is that Russia does not merely believe the U.S. is assisting Ukraine. It believes the United States is actively directing the war. And once a state internalizes that belief, its decision-making changes, escalation becomes easier to justify, red lines become tighter, ambiguities become threats, and ambiguous attacks, cyber intrusions, drone interceptions, border incidents take on a meaning they did not carry before. Inside the United States, intelligence analysts are now assessing a shift in Russian political psychology. The Kremlin's language has changed. Its diplomatic tone has hardened. Its military deployments near NATO's border have increased in frequency and unpredictability. Its missile forces are operating at higher rotation rates. Its commanders are referencing Western involvement with increasing explicitness. And its propagandists are preparing the Russian public for the idea that the conflict is no longer with Ukraine, but with America itself. From a realist lens, this is exactly how great power confrontations evolve. Wars do not escalate in dramatic leaps. They escalate gradually through changes in interpretation. At the beginning of the conflict, Russia framed Ukraine as the proxy. Now, Russia frames Ukraine as the battlefield and the United States as the adversary. That shift raises the stakes immeasurably. Because when Russia perceives the United States as its primary antagonist, the logic of deterrence enters the field. And deterrence between nuclear-armed states is never stable for long. Consider how the Kremlin must now interpret American behavior. Every new long-range missile shipment is not simply support for Ukraine, it is a direct threat to Russia. Every intelligence sharing arrangement is not merely surveillance, it is preparation for escalation. Every U.S. statement about supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes becomes a declaration of indefinite confrontation. And in the Kremlin's calculus, indefinite confrontation with the United States is something Russia cannot tolerate passively. It must counter. That is why, after this latest attack, Russian strategic bombers were repositioned. That is why Russian air defense systems were activated in regions far from Ukraine. That is why Russian submarines began shifting patrol routes in the Arctic and North Atlantic. That is why Moscow held emergency consultations with its Belarusian partners. And that is why Russian officials began referencing expanded retaliatory options in their public statements, vague language that signals flexibility in choosing where and how to escalate. The United States expected anger. It did not expect panic. And right now, inside certain elements of the Russian military structure, panic is exactly what is happening. Not panic in the sense of disorder, panic in the sense of strategic fear, because the Kremlin knows the truth. If Ukraine can strike this effectively, with this precision, with this intelligence support, then Russia's rear positions are no longer safe. Its generals are no longer safe. Its supply lines are no longer safe. And most importantly, its sense of battlefield control is no longer intact. This is the kind of psychological shock that great powers do not absorb quietly. Now consider Ukraine's position. Kiev's leadership understands the geopolitical impact of every strike it conducts. Ukraine is not simply fighting for ground. It is fighting for narrative, for momentum, for survival. And every time Ukraine exposes Russian vulnerabilities, it strengthens its position in negotiations, in diplomatic outreach, and in military aid pipelines. But Ukraine also knows that a cornered Russia is more dangerous than a confident one. This is where the situation becomes truly volatile. Russia believes the latest attack was an American operation conducted through Ukrainian hands. Ukraine believes Russia's anger is a sign of weakness. The United States believes Russia is preparing rhetorical space for escalation, and Europe believes the situation is drifting toward a phase where a single miscalculation could trigger a crisis far larger than the war itself. This combination, mutual suspicion, strategic fear, political humiliation, and rising stakes, is historically one of the most dangerous in great power politics. It is how wars widen. It is how rivalries harden. It is how deterrence breaks. When Russia blames the United States, it signals that the conflict has moved beyond the battlefield and into the structural struggle between two nuclear-armed giants. And once the conflict enters that phase, controlling escalation becomes far more difficult. The Kremlin is in a moment of uncertainty. The United States is recalibrating its risk assessments. Ukraine is pushing its advantage. And the world is watching a conflict where tension rises faster than diplomacy can keep up. Russia suffered a major blow. It blamed the United States, and now the global balance stands on a sharper edge than before. This crisis is not stabilizing. It is accelerating. And the next move from Washington or Moscow may shape the fate of this war far more than anyone expected.